We have 90+ research laboratories across the United States, about 2,000 scientists working on more than 600 in-house research projects. We define a data network as scientists working across projects on a specific research area. One of our key challenges is data management. With data being generated by government agencies, universities, private industry, nonprofit, individual farmers, how do we engage all of these groups to break down the data silos? If we can break down these barriers, we can more rapidly drive science forward, achieving our grand challenge goals before 2050. To help us do this, let me introduce AgCross, a hub designed to eliminate data silos. It provides our researchers an environment to share their data, their science, while engaging the American farmer. It maintains an individual project's identity while engaging other projects in what we call a network of networks. We have a network to study plant hardiness. The map on the screen here is a product from our plant hardiness network. AgCross is a new way to centralize our data and our science. It is a catalyst facilitating engagement. We envision all agricultural research projects being interconnected across the nation. AgCross is based on an innovative approach that we call the Vandenberg Principle. Here are Bruce Vandenberg and Jennifer Carter to tell us more.
The Vandenberg Principle is a standardized way to design tabs within AgCross. It consists of 6 or more tabs depending upon the study. The Overview tab tells a story about the site or collection. The Location tab explores the geographic representation of the site's field layout. The Methods tab tells us about the way measurements are collected and analyzed. The Visualization tab shows unique geographic representations of the data. The Analysis tab allows us to explore data in much more detail using tools. The Publication tab is a culmination of the study by presenting the scientist's publications. Links to the publication sources are provided here. This is a 6-step common framework that helps us standardize and improve scientific information gathered by the agricultural research community. Let's see how this really works with an example.
Of course, my topic.
So, welcome everybody to our first USDA Geospatial Symposium. Thank you for coming. It's a very good morning today. I'm Shirley Hall. I'm the acting GIO, and I am also the USDA Geospatial Program Manager. I'll be your MC. The video that you were just seeing was the Agricultural Research Service, the AgCross project that they have going on. There was a presentation that was given at Esri this week. They were up on the stage. It's kind of a big deal, and so we'll be playing that again during breaks and probably a little bit later in the day as well. I want to thank you all for coming, taking time out of your busy days and joining us. We have a lot of great presentations today. The purpose of the symposium was to showcase all the different work that is going on across USDA, and this is only a sampling. There are a number of different topics that we are going to be covering: innovation, how we're using it mainstream, how we're using it in day-to-day operations. We're going to be talking a little bit about how we build our resources. We've got a great keynote planned for the afternoon. We're going to be talking about geospatial champions. And Shannon Ham, who's the Deputy Administrator for APHIS, will be kicking that off. So I hope you'll stay with us the rest of the day, or if I know some of you in Washington kind of are in and out, that's fine, but we've got some great things scheduled. I hope you'll continue to join us. One other announcement, if you will, that I'd like to make is Forest Service on Tuesday also received a Making a Difference Award from Esri, and so we don't have a lot of them in the audience, but we do have some, so if we could give them a hand, and the ARS team. Great job, folks. Just Two little logistics heads-up things. There is a fishbowl in the back table where you came in. That if you have questions throughout the day, we please would encourage you to write down your question, throw it in the fishbowl. We will be, after the session, be going through those and working with, depending on if it's a question to a presenter or it's some other type of, from a strategic perspective, getting with the appropriate people and getting the answers to those, and those will be posted on the EGMO SharePoint site. That's where you registered, and that's where we'll be putting the PowerPoint presentations. And we may have this videotaped. We'll see how that goes. That was kind of a last-minute thing. So if that turns out, we'll actually have that posted. Unfortunately, the welcome was supposed to have been by the Chief Information Officer, Gary Washington. He was called away. He's not able to do that. So we are going to jump right into the main presentations and talk about the Geospatial Data Act and also the USDA data strategy. Ted Kauk is here with me as the Chief Data Officer. He'll be following me, and we're going to jump right in and get started. So if I can get the presentation up. So, Geospatial Data Act was signed into law in 2018, and it is a big deal for agencies and departments like ours because it essentially codifies the FGDC. It recognizes data as a strategic asset. It promotes and talks about improving access to data not only for federal mission work, but also for public health, economic growth, environment, and other purposes. And it promotes the use of quality scientific and other data to improve policy making, which in the geospatial arena, we've been talking about this for a long time, being able to use our geospatial data. In USDA, much of everything we do is either tied to the land, it's location-based, it's very specific to actually being able to take that information and make policy decisions. So the Geospatial Data Act is a positive thing, and it's also going to be part of the as data as a strategic asset for the Evidence Act and the Open Government Data Act, because they all work together. Okay. One of the things that I think the Geospatial Data Act also does, it does reflect the growing recognition of the essential role that geospatial data and technology plays. I think we're hearing that. For those of you that have been in USDA for a while, like I have, geospatial has tended to be on the side. It's a cool program, but it wasn't really fully integrated, and we're seeing that more and more, that we're recognizing the value. On the Geospatial Data Act, and I've had this question, well, for the Act, what does geospatial data mean? Well, it means, and this is specifically written into the law, that it's tied to a location on the Earth. It's generally represented by vector data sets, points, lines, polygons, other complex geographic features. It may be derived from remote sensing, it's satellite data. It may be derived from imagery, mapping, surveying technologies. It does not include classified information, sensitive intelligence, geospatial data, and it also does not include geospatial data and activities that are part of Indian tribal activities. Whoops, I'm going the wrong way. So the Federal Geographic Data Committee has been around for quite a while. Those of you that may have worked with it, I think it actually started in the 1990s, maybe even a little bit before that. And it always has been chaired by the Secretary of Interior and vice chaired by the Director of OMB. With the codification in the Geospatial Data Act, members of the committee are the heads of each of the covered agencies and NGA, and they'll designate a representative, and this is different because previously representatives have been the senior agency official for geospatial information, and it was usually delegated down, but it is now that position is to be held by an assistant secretary or the equivalent. And then there is some discussion about delegation, but that is where it's at right now. OMB is also supposed to have provided guidance 1 year from the law. That was actually last October. We are still waiting for that, but I'm sure that'll be coming shortly. The Data Act, again, formalizes the federal government structure. The Geo Platform, that's been there a great deal. People have been using it, but it's pretty much a pointer for information and data that's out there. And the talk is, how do we make the Geo Platform more extensive that actually becomes a true place for services and access to the data? Establishes the National Geospatial Advisory Committee, that's a FACA, that had been established some time ago, but this makes that group statutory, and that group is actually made up of industry, state and county representatives, and academia. There's a great deal of policy that the Act provides, and it does lay out specific agency responsibilities. I'm going to go over those now because these are important to USDA and agencies within USDA. I'm not going to read what you have here, but other than just to mention that we are to be doing a strategy, geospatial strategy. There will be a federal strategy that the FGDC will put in place that they expect to have the draft out sometime in March, April timeframe. And our strategic plan will need to fit within that, but I would anticipate that USDA will need a much more extensive strategic plan. It's not just about the data, but where are we going with all of our platforms, our tools, how do we get to the data? So there are priorities that USDA will need to review and also put into a strategic plan. It's very key that we can share our data, geospatial data, not only with other federal agencies, but also with the public, our customers. This is a direction that the Act really pushes, and this is a direction that USDA has been trying to go for some time as well. Resources to be allocated to fulfill responsibilities, that's a key item, and I know in discussions with other federal agencies, this is something I think we all struggle with. So it's good to have that in the Act, and this is something we'll be dealing with as time goes on. Geospatial standards are going to be very important in terms of ensuring that if we build new data, that we are building the standards as we move that direction. If we are utilizing data and building upon it, that we adhere to standards for that as well, that we make metadata available for any and all data that we put out there. And I'll put a little plug in, we are going to have some discussion on that later in the day as well, on metadata tools that are available to us, as well as what type of acquisition programs we have, that sort of thing too. And then coordination and work in partnerships with other federal, state, tribal, local governments. We do a lot of this now. Forest Service does a great deal of that. The FPAC does that with NRCS, FSA, RMA, and other agencies. APHIS, many other agencies are doing a great deal of coordination. That needs to be continued as well. Making geospatial information available, services available, talked a little bit about that earlier, but that is actually a responsibility that we will be actually audited on. And personal privacy, of course, maintaining that, and then The last on this page is, when applicable, whether declassified information can contribute to and become a part of the NSDI. I don't think there's a lot of that USDA does, but we do work with the CAC and other agencies and Civil Aeronautics Committee to actually work on some of our classified. So that's an interesting thing that we'll be doing. Then the last three, and number 11, the search all sources, including the GeoPlatform, to determine if existing federal, state, local, or private geospatial meets needs before expending funds. This actually has been a part of a lot of efforts that GAO had in place. Again, this puts it in the law, and this is something that I think that USDA has done a good job of trying to put in place for our NAEP program, some of our satellite programs, acquisition, but we'll have to continue this in the future. Federal funds that are received, if we are putting money out, that we are getting on contracts, getting high quality data, and appointing that contact to coordinate and lead the covered agencies will be a responsibility as well. There will be a yearly reporting requirement that USDA will have to comply with. Right now, the Federal Geographic Data Committee is in the process of putting together some templates that the departments can use to gather information and then feed it into a national report. So that's something that's going to be coming down the pike a little bit later this year as well. Budget submissions also need to include geospatial data. We need to maintain an inventory of all our data assets. This is something we're going to be trying to get an assessment out a little bit later in this spring here to make sure that we've got all of that captured for USDA. And then disclosing geospatial contracts, cooperative agreements, that's something that I think agencies that do active acquisition already do, but this is just a reminder that this is something that we will have to continue to do. There is a limitation on the use of federal funds for geospatial in that it has to comply with standards. If it does not, there are some waivers that you can use, but it actually depends on the timing, where the standards are, the data that you're trying to acquire, something that we already have a national data asset for, so that the FGDC has provided standards, and if so, it should comply with that. But if it's new data, if it's something new, then there are waivers that can be received. Okay, where are we at with the current status? As I mentioned, OMB has not provided guidance yet. We hope to have that soon. That will be in the effect of a revised OMB 116, and we expect that that will be actually providing a little bit more specific guidance than what we have in the law. Get down more into the details. There is a 2021 roadmap that's under development. We expect also to have a revised governance structure for the FGDC. So and the reporting and audits that I discussed as well. And the audits are done by OIG, as not GAO, but OIG will actually do an audit. Their first one is up essentially right this year. They had hoped to have information more mid-year to be able to actually gather their information and do the audit, but there is still question about, with the lack of OMB guidance, what exactly are they auditing. So that one is still in a little bit of flux. But if you are a agency that has a a national geospatial data asset, if you're one of the themes or you have a data set, you've already had some contact with me. We're trying to gather information with them, for them. And I'm not sure how well this shows up, but this is a timeline essentially of where they are at, the structure I talked about, the NSDI strategic plan. I mentioned that that's something that we have to provide, and then that will be coming out later in the fall. And there's an integration strategy that is part of that, and how do we actually get cross-representation on appropriate data oversight, and then the report to Congress. There are resources available to us on the FGDC. These right now are really just frequently asked questions and use cases. There's not a whole lot more than what you will find in the actual act, but they are kind of, if it's something you want to have more information. And by the way, all the slides will be posted on the SharePoint site, so you'll have access to this information. So just to recap, the Geospatial Data Act does reflect a growing recognition in the essential role of geospatial data and technology, and it does reflect the need to highlight our support for continuing development of geospatial data as a critical infrastructure for the nation. So I think for many of the people in this room, geospatial data is a very big thing. It's what we do every day. It's, like I said earlier, pretty much everything we do is tied to the land or it's location-based. So we're hopeful that the Act will help support that and that we can improve and integrate as time goes forward. So we're going to be doing something a little bit different with all the presentations. We'll be holding questions to the end. And at this point, we would like to show a short video on data and what it means across the nation as a whole and its importance. And after that, we will have a presentation from Ted Kaup.
I think we all ultimately want the same thing for our children. That is a shot at the American dream. It's the idea that no matter where you started in life, you have a shot of climbing up and achieving success. I think it's the central idea that draws immigrants like myself to come to this country. My parents grew up in very low-income families in India. America was a place that transformed their lives. And through my own personal experience, I've seen how the effects of that have cascaded across the generations. But if we look today, despite the fact that the American economy is one of the strongest economies in the world, children today, especially children who grow up in lower-income families, don't have very good odds of going on to achieve a higher standard of living than their parents. And so I went on to become an economist to try to understand why these differences were emerging. So in order to study issues of equality of opportunity, you fundamentally need data that allows you to follow people across generations. Big data. That has proven to be extremely difficult in social science. But a critical breakthrough came in 2010 when my colleagues at Harvard and I gained access to anonymized tax, census, and social security records, information from the government that would allow us to map the roots of poverty and inequality in our society. We realized that we had really struck upon a gold mine of information. As we began to spend more time with the data, the thing that we were amazed to see was that the roots of economic opportunity lie at a very local neighborhood level. Specifically, we found that there were high opportunity neighborhoods where we see kids go on to have high rates of college attendance, high levels of earnings. Then going down to the low opportunity neighborhoods, there were big differences in terms of children's outcomes. Digging further, we looked at families that moved across places, and we found that moving to a higher opportunity place earlier on in your childhood dramatically improves your life outcomes. And so these data show the geography of upward mobility across the United States. And I realized this could really change the course of lives in America.
My name is Nikki Manlapas, and I am a single mother to my 3-year-old son, Theo, in Seattle, Washington. Shortly after Theo was born, we were living with my cousin, and my immediate concern was the area itself. It was not ideal for raising a child. There were not so many parks or playgrounds or preschools. That was very hard.
I
think we want to be a country that has opportunity for everyone. And I think oftentimes there's the assumption that more expensive neighborhoods are just better, but what we see with the data is that that isn't always the case. We're seeing neighborhoods that might be relatively poor, but actually have really good neighborhood cohesion, where low-income kids actually do really well. And so what we did was start working directly with the housing authority in Seattle and King County, where some families have access to housing choice vouchers. But what we see is that low-income families who use vouchers oftentimes end up in high-poverty neighborhoods with low opportunity for the kids who grow up there. And so we're bringing the data to the table and using housing counselors, help recruiting landlords, additional housing services to make sure that families actually have access to these areas and these opportunities.
I found out about the Seattle Housing Voucher Program. After I got my voucher, there was a program, CMTO, Creating Moves to Opportunity. They gave me a tour of the areas they were concentrating on. We saw parks, playgrounds, schools. It was a great way to see the neighborhoods that had the best opportunities for raising families. This is my little casa. Okay, you coming? Having our own place feels really good. There's quite a few daycare centers around here. I know there's a good elementary school just up the street. I mean, I love this area.
What we're finding from this experiment is truly amazing. Some of the biggest impacts I've ever seen as a social scientist. Had Nikki stayed in the neighborhood where she lived before, our data showed that Theo's prospects would be dramatically lower than what they are now. Of course, you can't move everyone out of low opportunity areas to higher opportunity areas, but by using modern data, we can systematically study which types of places appear to produce better outcomes for kids, and we can learn lessons about how we replicate those environments in lower opportunity areas and give many more children from low-income families opportunities to succeed. And so the beauty of this research, what I find inspiring about it, is that it points to real solutions that can change people's lives.
I've always wanted Theo to have a great education. And because of this program, I really do feel good about his future. Now, he has opportunities that I never dreamed I could give him.
So good morning, everyone. Good to be here to see the variety of topics. I hope that that video, as it does for me, provides us with some inspiration for the unique power of government data. As we see the use of data within an agency, sharing it, sensitive data with researchers, the unexpected insights that then had a feedback loop into the work at Housing and Urban Development to improve their housing voucher program and outcomes for citizens. It's just one example among many. We also heard from Michael Buser at ARS about how geospatial data and our data strategy can help us to solve some really significant challenges with agricultural production and our environmental footprint. I also think about some of the major efforts that are ongoing with the Precision Ag Task Force that's looking to understand the gaps in connectivity, relationship to farms, and our ability to close those gaps and understand the needs of precision agriculture to continue to innovate in that space. So I again want to welcome everyone here. It's good to see the interest in the topic, and I think this is something that we're seeing across the federal space, a wider recognition of the value, the unique value of government data. The Evidence-Based Policy, Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act that was passed just a year ago, this Geospatial Data Act, the Federal Data Strategy, which was released in December of 2019, give us a really good foundation for the work to come and sort of unify the federal government around mobilizing to share our data more broadly and to look for opportunities to collaborate. So again, thank you for the opportunity just to talk to you a little bit about the data strategy. Obviously, we want to be looking very comprehensively at how we're collecting data from our customers in a streamlined way. We want to better understand all of the opportunities that exist for our leaders and employees in the field to make better decisions to serve our customers. And then, of course, the value of our data that we make available to the public to drive innovation. So I want to talk a little bit today about some of the work that we've been engaged in over the last couple of years. There's been a big focus at USDA around making data internally available across the department for decision makers and people in the field to make better decisions. And I want to give you an update on that activity and talk to you about how that dovetails into a broader data strategy that includes the work that you do, and to invite you and the work that you're doing with Shirley to engage and to be a part of that. So, as I know you are. So first, I just want to give you a quick update on some of the work that we did over the last couple of years. We worked with leaders over the course of FY18 and 19 to answer their most important questions. We worked with all of our chief executive officers and their offices, with our common administrative support data in HR and IT, procurement, property, and fleet. And then we worked rapidly to integrate that data into our enterprise analytics platform. In our second year in FY19, we worked across each and every mission area and talked to undersecretaries and major program leads to do the same thing, and to do this in a really iterative, rapid process to show the potential that we have to use our data and leverage it more fully across all of our silos. In a lot of cases, what we found was that if we could get people to ask their real questions and not think about the constraints of the data they thought they had, we often had the data in places that we didn't expect that could be brought together, or new forms of analysis like natural language processing that could leverage data that hadn't been tapped into before. And so the result is that missionaries across USDA just recently, with our last two mission areas in FSIS and MRP, each and every leadership team and field employees have access to dashboards that help them to make better decisions. And that integrates data both across all of our USDA agencies and data that's been brought in from other agencies and other sources. So I wanted to make sure that you are aware of kind of that growing need and demand for data that we're trying to meet, and how leaders and employees in the field are making those decisions. So a couple of examples. Things like a 360-degree view into the forests, where forest supervisors now have access into key metrics like timber sales, fuels treatments, wildfire risk, right? Those things that enable them quickly to dive into the areas that matter most to them to improve their decision making. And the food safety inspection service, give them 360 views into their plants so that they can quickly understand what's happening with sampling and get a better sense of the public health indicators that drive their work. This is happening in each and every mission area, and we hope that this work continues. We have a plan for continuing to drive the adoption of that, and we want to have some broader integration of this with all of the communities, including the geospatial community at USDA. This is just a quick kind of view into how adoption has progressed. We were really excited last year when we had about 300 views per month. We had just kind of gotten started, and so we had set a goal of doubling that. It actually has more than 10 times increased over the first year, and so that kind of speaks to the demand and to some of the, I think, virtuous disruption that's happening in the organizations. And those organizations are now pivoting to stand up leaders and centralized analytics teams to continue to drive this work across each and every one of our missionaries. So we'll talk about how that plays into the strategy. But this last month, I think in January of 2020, it may be a little bit hard to read, we had about 27,000 views in that month of the dashboards that have been created for decision making across the department. And we hope to see that continue to grow. So one of the things that we like to talk about with the work that we've done is that we made a conscious choice in the way that we engage with this strategy. There's a very large data iceberg, so to speak, and we all are aware of that, and we all kind of know the challenges of making improvements in those areas, and we all, I think, implicitly know some of the challenges and opportunities that exist. But we wanted to remind everyone that we did focus on the art of the possible. What could we do if we just asked the questions and then sought to stand up that platform and to integrate those data and to provide those insights? And so we have created those 200 or so dashboards. We do have people using that data, but we learned a lot through that process. We learned what we were able to do, and we also hit up against some opportunities for data standardization and data stewardship, and some of the challenges of integrating data for common data functions across the department, which give us a lot of information about how we can make improvements. And so the other piece of this is because of the excitement around data with leaders at USDA, there's now a larger and very significant commitment to focusing on this larger iceberg. And so that's the good news. We made that investment in getting people excited about it, and now we're going to be pivoting to improving our infrastructure, our data management practices across USDA. So in the background, sort of quietly, we were also, as we were doing the dashboards, we were also doing an assessment of our data and our data management practices. And we found, not surprisingly, that we have a lot of compelling strengths, especially in pockets, good data quality programs in places, some efforts in a mission area or two to try their hand at data governance, but there's a lot more to do there. And we also have at least one missionary that had a centralized analytics team. And so those best practices are things that we can leverage. There's best practices in the geospatial data community that we can leverage. But we found some common challenges that I think Shirley talked about that are common across the federal government. Things like how can we find the data that we have? It's not really an asset unless we can actually find it. We're duplicating a lot of work. We do not have data governance at the enterprise level across those mission areas to have sort of a strategic approach to our data. And so those are the things that we really want to shore up. So one of the first steps that we took was we established assistant chief data officers in each of our mission areas. Those people are here, or a couple of them are actually reporting next week, so it's a very new position. But those folks are, as you may see in the private sector, going to be responsible for leveraging our data as a strategic asset for each of those mission areas. And as required by the federal data strategy, each agency has a chief data officer and has an enterprise data governance board. And so they'll be serving on that board to help us take a strategic approach to our data. Just very quickly, I know this is a little bit of a slidegement, so we won't spend a lot of time here, but we do have a new data governance board at USDA that is, the steering committee is composed of our chief operating officers, those common functions across the USDA that have the chief information officers and the chief data officers reporting to them. And then our advisory board, which has started meeting and working to develop these working groups, is composed of our assistant chief data officers, and Shirley's also on that board and working to help think strategically with us about our geospatial data assets. And we've begun standing up standing committees for stewardship and working groups on things like assessing our as-is infrastructure and creating a to-be architecture for USDA's data, which would include our geospatial assets. And so I want to continue to invite you to ask questions and to be part of shaping that for the future, and I want you to be aware that that's happening. We've also have a roadmap, and while I won't dive into the requirements of the federal data strategy, just be assured that all the things that we're doing are helping us to meet the requirements of that. But we want to take a very business-driven approach. I think one of the things that other agencies have struggled with, and that each agency is going to struggle with, is resources, right? Our philosophy here at USDA, and I know this is something that the Secretary shares, is that we need to have a very business-driven approach. The demand ought to come from the business. There's value in this, and there's investment that can be made when people see the value in it, and that includes our geospatial data assets. And so, so I won't talk much about requirements, but the things that we're doing are designed to meet the requirements of the FY20 data strategy. So things like creating a USDA data catalog, creating a platform where the dashboards that we create internally can also be made to make our data more intelligible to the public. Looking to develop a data stewardship framework that creates common ways of managing our data and taking a very business-driven approach to defining our requirements, as well as our standards and data quality standards for the department. And so some of the activities that you'll see that are happening this year, each mission area is establishing a data governance board this quarter. They're identifying their business data stewards. They are developing their strategies for dashboard adoption, as we've just completed those last two mission area dashboards. And that work will continue over the course of this year and obviously into the future. Wanted to give you a little bit of a preview of the work that's happening here. This is just a little bit about the Assistant Chief Data Officer function and how we see that operating in the business. I do report to the Chief Information Officer. I do manage a lot of the infrastructure, including our enterprise analytics platform for the department. In the mission areas, the ACDOs will really be focused not on technology, but on fully leveraging the power of their data. So they'll be partners with the CIOs in the mission areas. And again, they'll report to the Chief Operating Officers. This is similar to what we see in the private sector. If we think about one example of our mission area in rural development, that's the fifth largest lender in the country. At this point, this is something that we really need at USDA, and if you looked in the private sector, you'd be hard-pressed to find an organization that size that did not have these positions, thinking strategically about things like risk in the portfolio from a data perspective. So a little bit about the positions there. One thing I just want to leave you with is the opportunities to kind of bridge some of our silos. We've seen the value in bridging some of our organizational silos. So when we were working with the Forest Service, for example, we were able to leverage wildfire risk models that had been created and actually, for the first time, applied it to operational treatments in the forests, how they're performing those treatments. And so combining geospatial data assets with non-geospatial data assets, there's also a vast opportunity to geocode some of our non-geospatial data to provide some of those insights. And there's also opportunities that we've had with again, bringing data from one agency to another. So for example, taking some of our NAS data with Cropscape and applying it to our acreage reporting data to give FSA a better sense of what's happening in the agriculture sector at large when there's a disaster, giving them the opportunity to see something that may be affecting people that are not their customers typically, but who may be in need from a relief perspective. A lot of opportunities to bridge the technical silos that we have across our communities, and I think in this community in particular, we want to engage in thinking about how we're leveraging the geospatial assets that are created and also integrating with the ways that leaders are making decisions today at USDA. So invite everyone to be part of that conversation. We'll be working with Shirley to talk about that. And then finally, just again, want to leave you going back to the video with that unique power of government data, the vast opportunities that we have that many of you are tapping into. Those three key questions about how we're looking more broadly across mission areas, how we're collecting data from our customers, how we're leveraging it internally for better decision making and moving up that analytics maturity scale, and then how can we better provide that data to the public in a coordinated way with an enterprise approach. So there'll be more to come on this as we develop more of the strategy and begin to implement it. And again, please send your questions through the mechanisms that Shirley's provided, and we'll be in touch. And good to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. We are going to move next into the presentations that we've got lined up for the day. I mentioned earlier that we're going to hold questions to the end and be getting started. I have to apologize. So our first presentations up today are going to be talking about geospatial innovation, and we've been doing some great things in USDA in terms of being on the cutting edge, moving towards new technology. We've got a lot of agencies that are doing a lot of different things. This is just 3 different presentations that are going to talk about different activities that we've got going on, remote sensing, and also in business intelligence, and also talking about mobile applications. So with that, I would like to introduce our 3 speakers to begin with, and then they'll also introduce the next one following them. But Dave Johnson from NAS is going to be up first talking about monitoring crop emergence with satellite imagery. Our second presenter will be Phil Roberts from the FPAC Business Center talking about the land change analysis tool, high-resolution land cover mapping, and Jason Koger from APHIS will be finishing the innovation session with talking about using mobile geospatial technology to mitigate wildlife strikes with aircraft. So with that, Dave?
All right, good morning, everyone. As you can see, I'm representing NAS, and I've been in this room many times, but I've actually never been up front, so this is kind of exciting. I'm going to keep this talk hopefully light, and I have a lot of graphics, so I'll probably be referring to them. I'll try to stay in front of the microphone, and by graphics, a lot of imagery. So many of you have to give this disclaimer. I'll give it 2, even though we're within the building. I'm going to be talking about satellite imagery and how we're using it, particularly towards a need we've recently had. As you know, this last spring we had a really late planting season, and it's actually harvest is still going on in parts of the country. And we've been tasked, or really looking at, can satellite imagery help us get at that information better than our surveys, or particularly when some of the stuff is happening after our survey efforts. So the satellite imagery I'm talking about comes from polar observing satellites. So these are, if you can imagine, the Earth rotating, they're going around, and they orbit about every 90 minutes, and over a given day, this is what we might capture of the United States. This is from Landsat. Landsat 8 has tended to be the bread and butter satellite. It's got a long history, 30 plus years. It's a multispectral sensor, so we can see in the visible bands, but also in the near infrared and farther infrared. The really nice thing about Landsat is this long history, so if we can look back in time and know what a cornfield looked like then, we can then look at an image from this year and say, oh, that's a cornfield. But it has the disadvantage of only having an image every 16 days. Sentinel-2 is from the Europeans. This was launched about 5 years ago, and the Europeans, through the Copernicus mission and the European Commission, have really upped the bar in terms of imagery. So where Landsat was observing at a 30-meter resolution, which is about the size of a baseball diamond, Sentinel-2 is imaging at 10 meters, so it's 9 times better spatial resolution. There's 2 of these satellites orbiting, so we're getting a revisit rate of every 5 days. And it is also multispectral, not quite as rich in the far infrared as Landsat, but it's been a wonderful sensor to start using. And then thirdly, in the commercial sector, Planet, they used to be called Planet Labs, they've been making a big splash in the news with their ability to take these really small CubeSat or small sats and literally put hundreds of them into space orbiting the Earth with the idea of collecting data at a daily rate when you put them all together. This is not free, where the other 2 data sets are free, and we've been challenged to figure out what this stuff actually costs, but it's in the millions, which could it should cost something, we agree with that, but whether would get the value out of that, we don't know, but that's something we're certainly looking at. It has fewer spectral bands just in the visible and near infrared, and because there's so many of these satellites, they're really hard to calibrate between. They're not all going over the Earth at the exact same time. So basically from here forward, I'm just going to show an example. It's northern Illinois. We have some fields where we got actually precision ag data, so we know exactly when these fields were planted. Of course, we know the crop type. We actually know the seed variety and the exact time of the day, and the seeding rates and all this stuff. But I'm just going to stick with the crop type and the planting date. So here's a Landsat 8 image. Again, I'll try to stay in front of the microphone. Some of my labels are probably a little too small, but most of these fields were planted either in April, late April, when you would normally expect them to be, but then the rain set in, and some of these other fields were not planted until June or even late June. There's a soybean field up here that was planted on June 30th. That is getting really late. There's a cornfield here, 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 here. Those are all around June 10th. There are some earlier ones. There's a April 20th cornfield. Another April 20th cornfield. So we have a variety of planting dates, and of course in this area of the country we don't have that much variety of crops, just corn or soybeans. So that was Landsat 8 on April 20th. It turns out that day we also had a Sentinel seen on almost the exact overpass time. So just to compare and contrast these, this is what you get from Landsat 8, 30 meters. We're looking at false color infrared. And here's the Sentinel-2 imagery. So you can really see that going from 30 meters to 10 meters improves the spatial resolution. It's not a huge surprise to us, but I'm used to looking or working in this domain and thinking, oh, that's good enough, but the Sentinel is a better sensor. And then it turns out Planet also captured imagery on this exact same date, April 21st, and they actually captured 2 images. So one was at 10:26, and the other one was at 11:24. The 10:26 one has something fun cutting through it. There's actually a contrail was captured. You wouldn't expect much to change on the ground, but there's actually evidence of field work up in this area. So they're doing some disking or something. So Planet has the ability at times to capture more than 1 image per day. So moving on to another example. July 10th, so Landsat captured this image. So At this point, most of these fields are emerging, so the red in this case is emerging crops, a lot of vegetation. This field up here, I said, was planted on June 30th. It is still in the brown color. There's a bit of a cloud there, but it is still not emerging. These are not emergent. This April 20th field is emerging. So that's what Landsat captured. Sentinel-2 is a nicer image. And then Planet didn't capture anything. So this tells us that Planet Labs is not necessarily capturing daily imagery, because this looks pretty cloud-free. That was pretty cloud-free. Moving forward again. And a final just example is on August 4th, Planet imagery. And at this point, most of the fields are emerging. This one's still kind of struggling. That was, but this day we actually got 3 Planet scenes. So that was 11:26, 11:27, so basically a minute later. This just happens to be where the scene swath cutoff was. And then here's 11:44. And if you look between 11:27, pay attention to this pivot field, pivot irrigation. It has moved a bit. So we're seeing stuff happening on the human scale with the Planet imagery. This is actually kind of my money chart where we're trying to absorb, so what is the frequency of this data? So plotting through time this area. The top row is the Landsat collections. If it's a circle, that means there was a chance at an observation, but if the circle is not filled, then it was cloudy or just we deem not useful. And actually the darker reds, those data sets don't yet exist. We're anticipating Landsat 9 to be launched in about a year, so for not this growing season, but the next. So at that point, we'll have that type of revisit rate, but we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 Landsat images over that time period in this area. The Sentinel, so it's collecting every 5 days currently, and so these are the filled-in dots are the ones where we got imagery. And then there's some small dots. It turns out this particular area with Sentinel is an overlap, so we're actually getting imagery every 2 to 3 days just by happenstance of the overlap. But this is actually what we got in terms of what I would consider useful imagery of this area. Notice the big hole in May. It was cloudy. It was raining. So we struggled to get that with Landsat or Sentinel. And finally, here's the Planet observations. So they really are close to imaging on a daily basis. They did miss probably a few scenes in here. I'm sure it was because of clouds. And the bigger circles are where we got more than one image on a given date. So just to step through this, I'm trying to get my clock up. I got a few minutes. I was just going to show what the Landsat imagery looked like if we're trying to look at emergence. So the first, I'm just looking at June and July imagery. So this is June 8th. And like I said, these fields here were not planted until the 10th, these 3 or 6 cornfields. So anything that's on the ground is probably just a little bit of weedy growth or volunteer growth from the prior year. And then I wish I had polygons for all the fields, but there's not a lot going on in terms of emergence yet, even for those April planted fields on June 8th. Our next Landsat observation was the 10th, so nearly a month later. That's a big jump in time. We would like to have more observations than that. But this field was planted at this time, but there's no emergence. We're starting to see some hints of emergence here. This field's fully going. And then July 26th, I kept it in there. It's a pretty marginal scene. This field here still isn't very emergent, lots of clouds. So looking at the Sentinel time series for the same June and July, this is June 5th. Had some clouds on that day. June 10th, that's a nice scene. The 25th, going between the 10th and the 25th. This field here appears to be greening up on June 25th, but we know it was not planted until the 30th. So this could trick a person, including myself, into thinking that was a planted field and we're seeing emergence, but that is probably just weeds because it's planted actually 5 days later. And actually, when we look at a July 5th image, then it's fully not red in this case, so it's definitely just soil we're looking at. On the 10th of July, we got this, the 15th, 20th, 25th. This field is starting to emerge. These are doing a decent job emerging. So that's what we got from Sentinel. And then finally with the Planet data, near daily observations. And again, I don't quite fully understand their orbit structure, and so some of these scenes may be cut off, but this is what we got on June 3rd, the June 8th, June 10th. This is a zoom in of a field on June 10th, just to show we are observing. This was the first one's at 11:24 Central Daylight Time, and then about 20 minutes later, so we can see with this planet data that some of the, to me, I don't know if there's disking or what going on. This field was actually not planted till later in the day, but we can see some of the field work going on, 11th, 22nd. And here's another June 25th. This soybean field, again, has not yet been planted, but we see what we think is vegetation on there, but that's just tricking us. 27th, 29th. On the July 4th, this field does not have vegetation on it, but it has been planted. So the planet really is giving a nice time series of what's happening on the ground. And really, I'm just going to end it there, and hopefully it was at least fun to look at these slides. And I actually work in this building on the 6th floor with most of NAS, so come visit me on 6040 if you have any questions. Thank you.
All right, thanks. That was really interesting to see all that great satellite imagery. So my name's Phil Roberts. I'm from the FPAC Business Center. I'm going to talk to you today about the land change analysis tool, some of the work we've been doing with NAPE imagery. All right, so a little background here. In the Farm Bill, it states that FSA is responsible to identify, reduce errors, waste, fraud, and abuse in farm service programs. So that's sort of the effort behind this project. We're looking at compliance. So this is a partnership between FSA's DAFO and the folks at FPAC Business Center, or APFO. The idea came from the 2017 Geo Summit, where Megan Kennedy asked a great question. You go to these conferences like we were at this week, and you see all this awesome tech, the latest and greatest stuff that's coming out, and we want to see, how can we implement that to do our sort of day-to-day work in a better way? So, really what we're looking at here is CLU. Common land units are how we implement a lot of these farm programs. And as a lot of you know, that's a huge database. There's 38 million records out there, and there's less than 7,000 county office staff across the country that have all the maintenance, editing, attribute information, all that workload is on them. So we're trying to help, improve that process with the latest technology available. So the way we want to do that is by using NAPE imagery and a machine learning classification system to produce land cover maps. We feel like that information can really help us in how we manage our CLU data. So we're going to try and automate this as much as possible, and the goal is to save time and money while improving the accuracy of the CLU database. All right, so I know this workflow diagram is pretty difficult to read. Don't worry about the details of it. We want to think about the sort of big picture here. There's really 5 steps that we're going to talk about: scoping, sampling, mapping, reporting, and the review process. So first, with the scoping, when we start this process, we meet with state GIS specialists, sort of the boots on the ground, the experts who know these areas. In those meetings, we try to get really 2 things by the end of that. We want to know the best way to design our sampling scheme for their state, and we also want to work on adapting our national class definitions to their local conditions. The best example of that is, with grassland. A grassland in Alabama or Georgia looks vastly different than a grassland in southern Idaho. So we need those sort of local experts to help us train our eyes so we know what we're looking at and how to best classify it. So once we've done that, we've done our sampling, we're getting ready to start our sampling process. And the sampling and the mapping and the reporting are really the fun geospatial pieces of this, so that's what we're going to focus on. So NAPE imagery is a huge data set, 1 meter resolution. It's moving down into 60 centimeter and 30 centimeter. There are 220,000 quarter quads that cover the entire country. Each one of those has 50 million pixels in 4 bands. So this is a massive data set we're talking about. And the way we're going to make that big problem more manageable is to break it into smaller little problems. So now we've got lots of little problems. And one way we're going to do that is stratifying the landscape with something called major land resource areas. This is something that NRCS produces. And the idea with these is that they're areas of similar geology, topography, precipitation, temperature, climate, ecology, land use, agricultural activities, and importantly for us, land cover. So we're going to use those to break this down into smaller regions. You can see what the MLRA map looks like from Alabama and Georgia. You've got the southern Appalachians there in the north. Then you get into the coastal plain and the Piedmont. You get the Black Belt and the Sand Hills. All those sort of unique geographic areas are broken out in this map. So we use that to stratify our sampling, and we're doing that on a county level. So here again is our MLRA map, and you can see some counties have been selected for model training. The way we're doing that is within each county, we pick all the quarter quads that are there, and then we apply something called condition Latin hypercube sampling to generate points from those images. CLHS is a random stratified sampling method, and it's a really data-driven approach. So we're looking at the distribution of each of our predictor variables. In this case, we're talking about the 4 bands of NAPE imagery plus an NDVI layer. So we use that to come up with our sampling points, and that's per quarter quad, per county in a given state. So for Alabama and Georgia, you kind of see the numbers of what we're talking about here. Tens of thousands per county, significantly more when we talk about a state. So the next step in this process, once we've generated these sample points from our imagery, we've built an ArcGIS online web mapping application where we overlay those points against the NAPE imagery and then apply a training label to each one of those. So here's what the app looks like when you have it up and running. It's hard to see, but there's a point right there in the middle. And in this image, you can see different land cover types. There's urban development, there's grassland, there's forest. And we've got a drop down over here where you can choose which land cover class best applies to that point. So now this allows us to really sort of crowdsource this. Right now we've got about a dozen or 2 dozen folks at APFO who work on this. When we're really up and running, we can do about 15,000 labels a week, which is a really large volume of training data. It's all keyboard shortcuts, so you can just sit at your desk, and if you're in Alabama, you just hammer that forest button, work through all of those. It's been great, and it's really allowed us to build a large, robust training library. So this really got started after the shutdown last year. We had worked kind of building up our strategy beforehand so that when we came back to the office in February, we could really roll with this. We did our first sort of beta test in June. You see a big spike there. We did another one in November of this year when we brought in some more states. So this has been great. It's allowed us to build this large training library of over 200,000 points, and we'll continue to roll on that. I actually got an email yesterday that the points in South Carolina are done, so that's nice. So moving down from sampling into mapping, sort of the third step of this process where the real geospatial stuff gets fun for us. We've developed our sample plan, we've trained our model, we're ready to apply our classifier, and we're using random forest machine learning to generate our models. I'll show you what one of these looks like. Here's an example from Geneva County, Alabama. In the middle, you have NAPE imagery. On the left, you see the existing national standard for land cover mapping. That's the National Land Cover Data Set, or the NLCD. In the OMB A16, USGS and the Forest Service are the national leads on this. They use satellite data. We saw some great examples of that just now. The Landsat is 30 meter resolution, whereas with NAPE, you're down to 1 meter or less resolution. So you can really see that spatial resolution jumping out at you. There are some trade-offs there, though. We don't have the temporal resolution. These states get flown roughly every 2 years. We also lose a lot of the radiometric resolution because we don't have that shortwave infrared and going out beyond that. So a couple things to kind of point out here. There's a stream running through the bottom portion of this image. And when you look on the NLCD, you see it's really pixelated and stair-stepped and kind of discontinuous, where in the LCAP map, you can see a continuous flowing stream there. There's also some urban stuff up near the top. You've got some roads and some structures. Here, it's pretty hard to discern what's really there, and in our maps, you can see, individual structures and roads pop out pretty well. So here's an example of a single quarter quad from Geneva County, Alabama. We've got forest, we've got crop, grassland, all the different land cover types that exist out there. It allows us to generate some pretty quick summary statistics. When we started this process, I didn't know that Alabama is roughly 70% forest. That's the kind of stuff we can come up with when we run this process. Another really nice thing about this, Geneva County is one where we have gone back through the NAEP vault. From everything from 2009 to 2017, we've run this process. And that really allows you to do some cool stuff with change detection, looking at that pattern over time and seeing, what's happening to my agriculture over that 8-year cycle. Where are we gaining? Where are we losing? What counties are up and down? And that works for all cover types, for urban development, for forest, all that stuff. So we can pull out a lot of good information from that. So far to date, we've done about 170 million acres in 5 states. We started with Alabama and Georgia. We then moved into Idaho. We wanted to try something that would be vastly different from a land cover point of view. And Idaho's great. Not only is it very arid, southern Idaho, you're looking at sagebrush and desert, but then when you get up north, you've got mountainous forest environments, lots of large lakes and stuff. So there's a good diversity of land cover types there. Another state we did was Connecticut. The reason we pulled that one in 2016, NAEP was flown, but also Connecticut acquired a statewide LiDAR data set. So we're really excited to try and work with that, bring in the LAS point cloud stuff, and use height as another predictor to really help us separate a green crop field from a green forest, or a plowed field from a white rooftop. I think that'll really help us further our classification. So as I mentioned, we just finished South Carolina. We're in the process of mapping that next. South Carolina and Connecticut were both done at 60 centimeter resolution, and that's really brought on some interesting IT challenges. Working on those really large data sets has its own unique challenges. The next state we've got lined up is Washington. That'll also be at 60 centimeters. So as I mentioned, the IT challenges, this is very process intensive. We're using RStudio to do our statistical analysis. And on a 1 meter quarter quad, we can do a single one in about 20 to 30 minutes. When we go down to 60 centimeter, that jumps up to 90 minutes. And it kind of makes me afraid to think about what's going to happen when we go to 30 centimeter. So in order to try and address that, we're working on developing a Docker solution. So this container technology, it's the same stuff they're using at the Esri notebook server, if you guys saw talks on that. But the idea is we'll be able to run our statistical software in these containers where we can have 10 of them running in parallel in tabs on a web browser on a dedicated server machine. So that's something we're working towards. Definitely a big challenge for our project. All right, so now jumping down to the reporting piece of this. We can make great land cover maps, but we don't want to just reinvent the wheel. How does this apply to the FSA business? You can see across the top, we've got our little workflow here where we start with a county shapefile. We can select cropland CLUs out of that to compare with our land cover maps, and then use that to identify potential errors and generate reports. So in our little diagram here, we've got some water, cropland, and forest represented in a raster map. When you overlay that with a CLU polygon, you can identify where the potential errors are going to be. This is something we've written as a Python script. We can run it as an ARC toolbox. The really nice thing about this is it's very customizable. Depending on how you select your CLUs, you can target cropland and look for things that are not cropland. Or you can look at CRP forest and train it to run on anything that's not forest, generate your errors that way. You can even get more specific and take targeted looks at, I want to find any water within a CLU. So a lot of ways we can slice that, and we know different parts of the country are going to have their own rule set for how this applies to them. So here's some examples of the kind of stuff we're catching in our reports. Same CLU we were looking at from Geneva County, Alabama. As we saw earlier, there's some urban stuff, there's some forest up there in the north, and a stream cutting through the polygon. That's stuff that's out of compliance, that's stuff that needs to get cleaned up under the current guidance. Over here in Dooley County, Georgia, we've got another example where we picked out this block of forest within a cropland CLU. That's about 5 acres that needs to get cleaned up. But looking at that, we see, maybe there's some better line work there that could incorporate more cropland. So same way we could run this tool the other way to identify cropland that's maybe not digitized as well as it could be. And another nice thing about this is that it helps you understand on the county level, where things aren't being applied, or maybe where people need more training, or where certain parts of the guidance are being interpreted differently within a given county and a state or between states. So far to date, just looking at Alabama and Georgia, we've run this against 700,000 CLUs. Of those, we've identified 42,000 as potential errors, and that's something that could eventually get looked at, get eyeballs on it, and get cleaned up. Based on our estimates from Georgia, to do a complete CLU review every time NAPE imagery becomes available would take roughly 70,000 hours, and we think using this method, we can get that down closer to about 700. So thank you guys very much for your time, and I'll turn it over.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jason Koger. I'm a staff wildlife biologist with USDA APHIS Wildlife Services Airport Wildlife Hazards Program. Today I'm going to be talking about using mobile geospatial technology to mitigate wildlife strikes with aircraft. Now I wanted to show this slide here today with this photo. That is a snowy owl, for those that you don't know. And the first caption I get there is like, why bird? Why are you here at this airport? But the other one is just the fact that, this beautiful species, the socio-political aspects surrounding that bird makes it really difficult for airport managers, airport biologists to manage that species. Thanks a lot, Harry Potter. Because we have some tricks up our sleeve, right? With USDA APHIS Wildlife Services, we provide federal leadership and the expertise to resolve these human-wildlife conflicts. We work with our civilian airport cooperators, our military cooperators, the aviation industry, and other stakeholders to reduce damaging strikes to aircraft and increase safety. Wildlife strikes happen every day. Some we hear about, a lot we don't. They can have dramatic consequences, fatal consequences. Top right photo, most of you should recognize that picture. That was Miracle on the Hudson. Right, the airplane that went down on the Hudson River after it had double ingestion of Canada geese. The bottom right photo, not so much coverage. That airplane went down in Russia. Suspected it hit gulls, but again, it was in Russia, so the data's a little sketchy coming out. But they're calling that the miracle on the cornfield because it was basically kind of the same event. And in both cases, those airplanes did not break up when they were crash landed. And they also thought that the corn, like the water, had a lot to do with that, right? The bottom left photo is of a Learjet from the Department of Homeland Security. I don't think they're in here today, that's why I wanted to show it. They hit a white-tailed deer when they were landing, and obviously you could see, or maybe it was takeoff, I can't recall, but obviously you could see, it was a total loss of aircraft, right? Fuel started spilling out, catches fire. Luckily, no one was hurt in any of these cases. Here's kind of the scope of our work. We're just over 100, I know the math's wrong here, but we're just over 150 locations with at least one full-time personnel, staff, right? We have our state program in Guam, obviously our state program in Hawaii, but then we're starting to do a lot more OCONUS work with our efforts with the Air Force. Currently, right now, we're at Ali Al Salim, Kuwait, Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, and Kandahar Air Base in Afghanistan. And right now, as we speak, my brother is in Bagram, basically mitigating wildlife strikes for our military over there, right, supporting the mission. But basically what we try to do when we're managing wildlife on airfields is to have this integrated wildlife damage management approach, right? And it's a tiered system where the first thing we want to do is modify the habitat. So there's 3 quality elements of wildlife habitat, and that's food, water, cover, right? And depending on where those resources are in an airfield can cause species like a deer to go across that runway a good bit of times, especially if there aren't fences on these airfields. And yes, there are some airfields that don't have fencing, which is just, a shock to all of us in our profession. We always say it's like, you should have built the fence before the runway, right? We can minimize some of this stuff. But at any rate, we have habitat modification. That's the biggest thing. We have to manage the habitat, make it least unattractive for any species to come in and want to hang out there. Then we look at exclusion. That's fencing, right? Fixing culverts so coyotes can't access our airfields, things like that. Harassment is huge. We use pyrotechnics, our car horns, clappers, anything we possibly can to scare these birds or any other wildlife away. We do a lot of capture and relocation, especially with raptors, birds of prey. Catch those birds, relocate them. Hopefully they never return again, but they do. They do return. And then last but not least, if needed, we do lethal removal for those individuals that won't harass, or they keep coming back, or if they're an immediate threat to an aircraft landing or departing. But at all phases of this, we need consistent species monitoring, right? Because we have to measure what we're managing. So what we're going to get into is showing you how we are using the cloud to gather that species monitoring data. But I just want to make note that out of all those tiers, we will eventually be capturing all that data in the cloud, right? To be able to share that data then to our cooperators and stakeholders, some of it to the American public to make sure, they know what we're doing out there. So here is a snapshot of Esri's Survey 123 mobile data collection app. Pretty easy to work with. Quick show of hands, anyone using Survey 123? Okay, great. Yeah, as you know, it's pretty simple to work with. We designed this form over many years, it was a bottom-up approach, right? We were taking field data sheets from all of our state programs, finding out what people collect, and then obviously trying to standardize this into one system. This screenshot just shows general airport survey information, such as date, time, the state, airport name, what type of survey you're doing, weather, and it kind of gets cut off there, but we'd look at even moon phases, high tide, low tide, things like that affect wildlife activity. And then from the airport survey information, which you can favorite, and then every subsequent observation you can just paste favorites, so you only have to enter that data for each survey period, which makes it nice, a little bit faster data capture. And then the next group of information is kind of the meat and potatoes, right? What type of wildlife did you see? Where was it? There's a mapping function that you can see kind of in the middle there. What was it doing? Was it nesting? Was it feeding? Flying, passing? Was it struck? Did you find it dead? Things like that. Now, the idea of that is now at all these a little over 150 full-time duty stations that we have, that we're going to be collecting this data, right? And it's, ever growing. And the bullet says, right, just have a standardized automated geospatial data collection system for quicker data analyses and reporting. And basically what this means is good data will lead to a better understanding for us as airport biologists of what the spatial phenomena is going on with a certain species, which will then lead to better management recommendations that we can give to our cooperators so they can kind of understand what's going on. We can prioritize those management strategies, and then our cooperators can basically focus the resources they need to take care of whatever problem we tell them that they have, which are a lot, right? So some examples of this. This is a great map that's had a lot of longevity. My colleague Hunter Ray, who's in the back, this was presented at the Esri plenary a few years ago. And I think it's just awesome data that basically shows this pre and post treatment of when we basically poison small mammals to reduce the use of raptors on an airfield. Such a powerful tool. So basically you got 12 months of monitoring. Hunter makes the recommendation, hey, we got a lot of raptors here. Let's do some type of rodenticide treatment. Ask for $10,000. There's usually maybe some back and forth. Hunter's probably been asking that for years, right? Finally, they say yes, and he's like, cool, I got that pre-data. Do the treatment. He takes 12 months more of data. There are the results. About a 60% reduction of observations of raptors over the course of those 2 years after that treatment. Do you think it's going to be hard for my colleague Hunter to ask to get that $10,000 again when they're dealing with millions of dollars in damages of strikes? Not at all. Another great example is how we're going to also leverage our risk analyses that we do from strike reporting. Again, example of the hotspot. As you can imagine, that's the lake, more of a bigger pond. But anyways, this was about an 8 to 10 year project where typical data collection procedures, reporting with just tables, charts, and paragraphs, if you will, it was really hard to try to figure out how we can remove this lake. And this is Buckley Air Force Base in Colorado. After 1 year of collecting this data, running our strike metrics through, finding out the Canada geese was the highest, riskiest species at that base. And then the base commander says, well, where are the geese? And you say, well, they're on the water. And they said, okay, we'll get rid of the lake. So what took about 8 to 10 years of conversation when we started giving this level of data, it was 2 years. And this is the point in training. We instruct a lot of folks that work at airfields where we tell people we don't expect them to move mountains, but they sure as hell can move a lake. This is the FAA Wildlife Strike Database. It was a little over 200-some thousand records in that. It actually might be a little bit more. The idea of that is we're capturing all of our civil strikes in one database that hopefully down the road we'll be able to kind of relate from the field where we can collect this data, it can just upload into that database. But if not, we're still going to map our strikes, because what happens is then you can kind of see this is Denver International Airport, Colorado. You can see where some of these strikes are occurring. Why, right? And it all goes back to habitat. The top right picture, just poor drainage, right? Water comes in, it's the middle of summer, you got all kinds of water, you got all these birds wanting the water, and then they're getting struck left and right. Airport calls us, get out there, take care of this. Our planes are getting hit by birds. There's no damage, but it's just the event happening. Obviously the airport pays us to be there. They want us to take care of it. Anyway, so we capture this data, and real quick, things like that get fixed. Now, that's not the exact one, but there was a lot of these different drainages that became fixed just like that. The thing is here. There we go. Yes, I just wanted to end my talk. I could have went a little bit longer, but I know the time was getting a little bit. So I just wanted to take this time real quick to just thank a few people. Shelby Scrivani for helping me navigate the cloud, right? This is all new workflows. So she's been very helpful in that, and I look forward to working with her in the future. Ms. Shannon Ham, Associate Deputy Administrator at PBD. Shannon got us to the cloud. Thank you, Shannon, for showing a bunch of wildlifers to the cloud. My supervisor, Mike Beeger, National Coordinator of the Airport Wildlife Hazards Program, and then Wildlife Service Leadership, Mr. Martin Mendoza, Associate Deputy Administrator, and Ms. Janet Bucknell, Deputy Administrator. Thank you. And at this time, we'll take any questions from myself or the other speakers.
We have mics up front too, right there. Questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question for Phil. Got really interesting tools, and the Forest Service is working on a similar tool called Landscape Change House, LCMS. And I'm just wondering if you're aware of or maybe opportunities to collaborate. We're right downstairs from GTAC, so I'm talking about it.
Yeah.
So the question, is that better? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, the question was about Forest Service is developing a tool called LCMS for land change monitoring, and we were talking about the possibility for collaboration there. The Forest Service Geospatial Technology Center is co-located with us in the same building, so we do have some good contacts up there, and we'll kind of follow up and see if we can benefit from that. Thanks.
My question was also for Phil. You said you had 170 million acres you've mapped. Is that 1 meter resolution? So doing my math, that's at least 1 trillion pixels. Do you really have the compute for that? I want to say yes, because we've done it. But where are you getting the compute, I guess? I literally set up laptops and
Everybody's so close, it's easy. The question was about the compute power for this. To map that much acreage at that level resolution, it's a massive computing requirement. We have a very not ideal solution right now where we're using basically any old laptop I can get my hands on and the multiple VDI accounts for people within our work group. That's one of our biggest challenges, is trying to streamline that, parallelize it, and really increase our processing capacity.
It's not in the cloud, it's all local, cobbled together.
Yes.
Well, it's a pilot project, right?
Yes.
It's just starting. Okay. Anything else? And if not, we'll come back in 15. So if we could start at 10:15, y'all come back. We've got some really good presentations scheduled for the next session as well. Thank you.